In the name of God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Amen. Please be seated. Last week and this week, I'm preaching two connected sermons. It's probably too short, two examples to call it a series, but they are connected. Last week, I talked about the fact that St. Luke's congregation is in a very awkward and difficult situation without a rector, and called this the interim time between one rector and the next. And I talked at length about the tasks of the developmental period. And some of you wanted to know what they were, all in one sheet of paper, so that's included in your bulletin for today. And that's one piece of what this congregation should be working on and thinking about as it is moving through this interim period. Another thing, which is the subject of the sermon today, is the paradigm, what the model is for this congregation. What we think of when we think of St. Luke's Church. I'm going to tell you about a congregation that I served, and then that'll kind of connect, say a little bit more about what paradigms are, and then that'll connect with the gospel reading, which we just heard. There is a congregation in southern Maryland, in this diocese, in St. Mary's County, that was founded in the mid-1600s. Congregation worshipped in a succession of log cabins, so to speak. But then a few years before the Revolutionary War, they built a brick structure which is still standing and which is still in use today. The congregation was chartered by the Maryland as a parish by the Maryland Vestry Act of 1692. This is tobacco country. And back since colonial times, there have been tobacco farms, first operated with slave labor, then later a combination of black and whites working together. Tobacco is a hard crop, lots of work, lots of different steps in the process. So the people who farmed tobacco earned their money, but it was a good cash crop. And the families in this congregation had been, one way or another, connected with the tobacco industry, going back generation and generation and generation. Everybody in the congregation knew whose parents they were and the grandparents and so forth. It was like a large extended family. But it had come to decrease in size as children moved away to places where there were other industries other than farming. And so the congregation kind of dwindled and then stagnated at a certain point. And that coincided with a change in the tobacco industry. In the late 1990s, you may recall that various state attorneys general filed multi-million-dollar lawsuits against the tobacco companies in order to be recompensed for the reimbursed, I guess is the proper term, for all the expenses that state governments had borne because of the illnesses that people had contracted from smoking. And the lawsuits were successful, and large amounts of money passed from the tobacco companies to state governments. The state of Maryland decided that it would try to put an end to tobacco use using that settlement money, and they offered tobacco farmers a buyout, that they would compensate the farmers large amounts of money if they stopped growing tobacco. And almost all of the tobacco farmers took the deal. it was almost too good to be true. And some of them switched to other crops, using the money that they received to make that transition. And others decided to sell their land, pocket the money from the settlement, and reap a profit on their property. And they sold their land to developers. And developers came in and chopped up the tobacco fields and planted houses instead of tobacco. And these dwellings were very popular. People in the district in Prince George's County found that they could have a larger house on a larger lot with a decent school system for their children and a longer commute. But that seemed worth the price. And so these houses sold quite quickly, and it was only a short period of time that the area around this congregation had changed from tobacco fields to housing developments. And yet the congregation was like it was in a bubble. It continued to exist as though nothing had changed. Yes, there were a few of the new people, the young families with children, who had come to the congregation, but by and large it was still the same old families that were old both in terms of generations and in terms of their actual age. The Diocese of Washington asked me if I would go there to help the congregation get more connected to its neighborhood. And I said I would do that. And in the fall of 2000, I started this congregation. At first, I got to know the people. And I was especially interested in the few young families, the new people who had come to the congregation. And I realized that they had not been very warmly welcomed. They were there, and when they coffee hour after the service, they chatted among themselves, and the older people just chatted among themselves, and they didn't really connect with each other, kind of like ships passing in the night. And so I asked these new people, why are you here? I mean, you don't seem like you're fitting in very well. And they said, well, they were different answers, of course, but the pretty much common answers was, we want to worship in an Episcopal Church, and this is the closest Episcopal Church to our new house, and so we're here, and we're hopeful that things will change. And I said, would you like to be part of that change? And they said, yes, we would. So we started talking about what would be needed to make the congregation more attractive to people like them, young families with children. Of course, first of all, they wanted a Sunday school. And they wanted to have some spiritual guidance for themselves, a Sunday school for adults as well as that. And they wanted a different kind of service, a simple service that would be more child-friendly, with simpler music, and a message that kind of spoke to them where they are. So we started fleshing out just what that might look like. We held some events through the course of that year for the community, and people came and they were interested in these new possibilities. But in the spring of the year, we started making concrete plans to start a new service in the fall. It would be at 9 o'clock. And it would be very much like the Gospel Mass here at St. Luke's. Simple, child-friendly, music that isn't in the Episcopal Church hymnals. We did some research, and we found that there was a publishing house that published a hymnal that includes songs like Take My Hand, Precious Lord, as well as some contemporary gospel music. So we ordered those. In order to have a Sunday school, we needed classroom space. rented a mobile building, had it installed in the parking lot. We tried to find some musicians who could lead the music at this new service. But we didn't have enough money and there weren't that many people available, so this company that published the hymnals also published CDs that had instrumental tracks that accompanied the songs. Not the singing, not the words, the instruments. So we got a karaoke machine to play the CDs, and people sang along. Key thing was the Sunday schedule. We need a little bit more room in the Sunday schedule, so the new service was to be at 9 o'clock. So we moved the 8 o'clock service back to 7:45, but otherwise it stayed exactly the same. And the 11 o'clock service, well, that moved to 11:15, but it stayed otherwise the same. And that gave time for the 9 o'clock service, 10 o'clock Sunday school for children and adults, and then a fellowship time that started at about 11 and continued while the 11:15 service was in progress. We scheduled it to start the Sunday after Labor Day, 2001. And for the first couple of weeks, there were people who were usually the regulars at the early service or the late service who came to see what the 9 o'clock service was like, and then they went back to what their choice was. Others stayed, but the young families with children had told their neighbors and their friends about this new service, and they started coming, and more started coming. And word of mouth spread so that by December, there were about 50 people at the 9 o'clock service, and there were maybe 10 at the 7:45, and about 20 or so at the 11:15. By January, the 9 o'clock service had grown even more, so that it was larger than the other two services combined. And the older members of the congregation started getting restless. The congregation, the 9 o'clock group, continued to grow. There were 100 in the church on Easter. The end of May, Bishop Dixon came for her annual visit, and I presented to her 15 people to be baptized, adults and children to be baptized and confirmed, the largest number that anybody could remember being presented at one time in that congregation. It looked like this new service had taken hold, and that simple word-of-mouth communications had promoted it, and that it was going to continue to grow. Well, what I didn't know at first was that in January, when the 9 o'clock service got to be as large as larger than the other two combined, the old members of the congregation started writing letters to the bishop, complaining about me and complaining about these new people who were taking over their congregations. And Bishop Dixon wrote back to them that she would be happy to meet with them when she came for her visitation in May. She did that, and she met with them and listened to what they had on their minds. It was pretty angry and pretty harsh and very, what she was unwelcoming. Bishop Dixon listened and told the older folks that she was actually very pleased that the congregation was growing, and that the congregation now included people who lived in the neighborhood who had just moved there fairly recently, and that she hoped that they would find ways to welcome them. That plea fell on deaf ears. And in June, at the regular vestry meeting, the vestry voted to ask for my resignation, which was within their rights. Our contract was such that either party could terminate the agreement on 30 days' notice. And so that was what we did. I continued until the middle of July, and my last service there was the last day of the 9 o'clock service, because the following week they went back to the old schedule of 8 o'clock and 11, with about 25 people in the church. And all the people who come to the 9 o'clock service scattered. Some stopped going to church altogether because they were upset. Some went to other Episcopal churches, but most of them who hooked up with another congregation went to the Methodist church because they had also started a service like the 9 o'clock service. Why did this happen? And why did the vestry provide the money to rent the mobile building, to buy the hymnals, the karaoke machine? There were a number of expenses involved with starting this 9 o'clock service, and the vestry proved that. They seemed to consent to what I had proposed. And I think what happened was that when I said we wanted to start a service that would attract young families with children, they didn't think about the new people in the neighborhood. They thought about themselves when they were young adults with children back in the 50s and the 60s, and how the congregation then had a lot of young families with children. The current generation of all the tobacco farmers and the others involved in the tobacco industry, part of that large extended family that I mentioned. And then when the 9 o'clock service started to grow, they realized that this was a bunch of strangers coming into the church. They weren't their family. In fact, they didn't know these people's parents or grandparents. They knew nothing about these new people, knew nothing about growing tobacco, knew none of the history of the area. They were just moving to a place in the suburbs where they could have a house they could afford. And that didn't fit with that mental image they had of what it meant to have a service to attract young families with children. They had a paradigm of their congregation that was limited to their own experience. What they'd experienced back in the golden years of the congregation in the 50s and the 60s. And they thought that what I was talking about would take them back in history to that good time, the good old days. Of course, that's impossible. But that's what they were thinking. And so that congregation today is dwindled still more, as have, incidentally, other Episcopal congregations in their area that are now teaming up to see how they can share a part-time pastor. They've been without a full-time, regular pastor for a number of years. All of these small congregations. The future is not bright. Paradigms. They can control us unless we resist their pull. Paradigm is a way to do things that works. At least works for a while. My mother taught me to do various household chores. How to wash the dishes efficiently. How to make a bed. How to do the wash, how to sort the wash. And I still, at my age, follow that same paradigm because it hasn't let me down. Now, if something drastic should change in the way dishes are washed, of course I should add here that now some of the dishes go in the dishwasher, which wasn't the case when my mother first taught me how to wash dishes, there was no dishwasher in our house. But now that's there, but there's still some things that I wash by hand, and I do it the way my mother taught me. Make the bed that way, and so forth, because it works. I've done this here before, 3 years ago. I was here shortly before the 9 o'clock service was about to start. This watch was given to me by my parents when I graduated from high school in 1962. My birthday was a day or two before or after, I forget. So this gift did double duty. It's a Bulova watch, self-winding, 23 jewels. It has a mainspring and gears. The jewels are there to keep the gears from wearing out prematurely. I don't have to wind it because it's self-winding. But after a while, with all those gears and mechanisms moving in this tiny space of a watch, dirt builds up inside and has to go to the jeweler and you take it apart and clean, put it back together again, and oil it so it's back in tip-top working condition. But this was a good watch for the money. My parents weren't wealthy. If they were, they probably would have gotten me a Swiss watch, because Swiss watches were the ultimate timepieces back then, still the case, I believe. And the Swiss had the largest market share in the world for watches, and the watch, it was the standard for mechanical watches, because that's all there were, mechanical watches. The Swiss watch industry had a laboratory in Switzerland where they employed engineers whose task was to be constantly looking for improvements to this mechanical watch, to make it even better. And they did that. But they also experimented with some new ideas. And they came up with a revolutionary design for a watch. It's this one, a quartz movement watch. I bet you're surprised to learn that the Swiss invented it. They did. But when these engineers took the quartz movement watch to the watch manufacturers and said, this is the watch of the future. No moving parts. It's electronic. It has a battery instead of a mainspring. Sure, the battery needs to be changed from time to time, but there are no gears or other mechanisms to get all dirty inside. It's a solid state watch. This is the watch of the future, the engineers said, and the watchmakers laughed at them. The watchmaker said, how can it be a watch if it doesn't have a mainspring? If it doesn't have gears? That's what we're good at. We make watches with mainsprings and gears, and we make the best watches in the world. Why should we want to change to some gizmo like this, some gadget? Forget about it. Go back to work. Make the mechanical watch better. And so the engineers shrugged their shoulders and they went back to their laboratory and they said, well, I guess that's a failure, but let's take it to the next watchmakers' congress. It was never patented. They took the quartz watch to the watchmakers' congress, and Seiko, that's what this is. This is a Seiko watch. And Texas Instruments saw it, figured out what it was, copied it, patented it, and took over the market in watches. Because this was so much more reliable and so much more efficient, simple than the mechanical watch. Watchmakers in Switzerland could have been on top of the curve, but they had paradigm paralysis. They they had an idea that a watch could only be made one way. And even when presented with a different model, they refused to accept it. So I was given this Seiko watch on my 50th birthday in 1994. And it's a good watch, but it's expensive to keep up. And I got a Timex if I can get it off my wrist. Kind of a utilitarian quartz watch. It's got a light in it, lights up the dial. It's very handy in the dark. But this is the watch I use now. This is a digital watch, not mechanical, not electronic, digital. It's a Fitbit. The watch talks to my phone. And the watch tells my phone how many steps I've walked. And that gets translated into miles and calories burned. The Fitbit takes my pulse, and I can find out what my pulse is on my phone. It monitors my sleep. And even though I wear this to bed, this is in the other room getting charged during the night. And when I get up in the morning, I can see how well I slept, how many hours I've had in light sleep or deep sleep, and so forth. It's fascinating. Some say too much information, and that's probably true. But just that in my lifetime, we've gone from a high-quality mechanical watch to a high-quality quartz watch to a very inexpensive but reliable quartz watch to this smart watch. And each step, there were those who said, no, that's not a watch, because it's not what the old one was. That's paradigm paralysis. And what we need is the ability to shift paradigms. And that's what that congregation in Maryland was unable to do. It was unable to shift paradigms. So were the disciples unable to shift paradigms and lead this life. It's hard to talk and put on a watch at the same time. The disciples were traveling with Jesus. And to pass the time, Jesus asked them, who do people say that I am? Were the disciples clustered around him, the disciples or the crowd was further back. There was always a mention of the crowd, but we don't know too much about it. But Jesus asked the disciples, who do people say that I am? He may have been referring to people in the crowd. And the disciples gave the obvious answer. John the Baptist, Elijah, one of the prophets. Because that's the way Jesus had been acting and talking up until that point. He'd been acting like a prophet. Now sure, John the Baptist, Elijah, and all the other historical prophets were dead. So they didn't mean that he was Elijah, returned to life. They meant that he was doing things like Elijah did, and he was. Jesus had so far been following the prophet paradigm. So now Jesus asks them, but who do you say that I am? Long silence, I think. And then Peter says, you're the Messiah. Now that was a leap of faith, because Jesus had not exhibited any behavior or spoken in any way like a Messiah. Now, when Peter said that, he was probably thinking of a paradigm for a Messiah, someone like King David or King Solomon, a charismatic leader who united people behind that leadership, and who was a military man who led the people in battle, both to conquer territory and to secure the boundaries of their territory. And there was a hope in those days that Peter may have been articulating, a hope that someday there would be a Messiah like David or Solomon who would unite the Jewish people in Palestine, and they would throw off the Roman oppressors and once again restore the Davidic monarchy. This was the dream. And so perhaps Peter was projecting that desire for the Messiah paradigm onto Jesus. But then Jesus gives them a third paradigm, tells them what the future will look like. And he says that he will be rejected by the religious authorities, that he will suffer, that he will be killed and raised on the third day. And Peter says, no, that's not what we bargained for. Go back to being a prophet, or go back to being the Davidic Messiah. We don't like this Messiah who was rejected, suffers, and is killed and raised. And Jesus says, Peter, get behind me, Satan. He calls Peter Satan, the devil, evil, trying to discourage Jesus from being the Messiah that Jesus is called to be. And then Jesus takes it a step further and tells the crowd who's following him, as well as the disciples, that if they want to be his followers, they need to take up their cross and follow him. If you want to save your life by playing it safe, you're going to lose it, Jesus says. But if you're willing to lose your life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel, then you will gain your life. Paradoxical, but containing the truth. And so that's the message that we are given. Jesus is unique in being a leader who doesn't take care of those who follow him, but he wants those who follow him to be a leader like him, to do the things that he does, to draw people closer to God's love. And that's why we're here. Which means we need to have the ability to shift paradigms. We need to be able to find ways as circumstances change, as neighborhoods change, as industries evolve, disappear, or transform into something else, to be able to reshape the message of the gospel and the way we live our life as a congregation to match those changed circumstances. I said last week that the 9 o'clock service, the gospel mass, is the path to the future for this congregation. More people living in this neighborhood are going to be attracted to that style of worship, and are going to be attracted to this style of worship. Not to say that this is good or bad or otherwise. It's just what it is, and different strokes for different folks. And so we need to find ways to match what we offer as a congregation to the needs and desires of those who need what we have to offer, which is the love of God through Jesus Christ. So we're at a point in this interim period where we need to think about the paradigm. When we go to bed at night, what do we think when we think about St. Luke's? Do we think about the St. Luke's of 50 years ago? St. Luke's of 20 years ago? St. Luke's of today? Or the St. Luke's of the future? If we start looking at what St. Luke's will be in 5 years or 10 years, and if we see that it's going to match what this neighborhood is like in 5 or 10 years, then we'll be seeing a different paradigm for this congregation. But the point, the ultimate point, is to show forth from this congregation God's love